Hello and welcome to another Spark AR tutorial video. In this video we'll be talking about one of the newest exciting features to come in Spark AR Studio as of version 104, and that is the keyframe tool, or keyframe patch rather. So what is a keyframe? How is it useful to us, and what does it allow us to do in terms of our creative expanse within the AR field? So what you will see on screen at the moment is we have this very rudimentary, and I mean super rudimentary, Christmas tree, which is just something that was whipped up in Blender in a couple of minutes really. And we have these little baubles that are spinning around and they're changing colour. That's being controlled by keyframes in this case. We could also control everything using transition patches. However, you will find that when we're using transition patches, there's some limitations to them. So they've still got a use case. For example, if I wanted just the tree parts to rotate around themselves, then transition patch would do that job fine. But if I wanted something to move from point A to point B to point C to point D, then to point A again, then it probably makes sense to use keyframes just to give us a little bit more control. So if I just click on the screen here, you will see we have this keyframe graph. I'll go through what this is when we start building our own little basic keyframe effect in Spark AR, but essentially these are our point in time, our values. So what keyframes are, if we was to look at, for example, a video editing program like Premiere Pro, Avid or After Effects, keyframes are a capture of data at that point in time of values. And the way Spark AR currently deals with keyframes is in a linear method. So what we mean by this is we have our values at point A or point 1 or at the beginning of our timeline. Then we have our secondary keyframe where we've changed the values, either whether that's size, color, position, whatever, later down the line. And what happened is, in a kind of linear manner, the values will change from these values to here. So if it's 0, 0, 0, it would go to 1, and we said over here it's going to be 100, 0, 100. It would go 0, 0, 0 through to 100, 0, 100 incrementally. This is a bit different from kind of other keyframe methods. So we have things like ramps where things will start off slow or start off fast and then slow down, and you get this kind of curve. Spark AR doesn't allow currently for curvature animation, so we do have to kind of play about with linear values. So you will start to, if you're not careful, start to find that animation can become a little bit jittery. So, and the Spark AR animation at the moment is a little bit behind where it needs to be, I think, for the longer term. But anyway, it's a welcome addition and we'll go through it now. I'm just going to show you a sample of a linear animation here. So this is an After Effects linear animation. These are denoted by these little diamond icons, and we'll get used to these diamond icons in Spark AR Studio. So I'm going to just come back out of my patch editor here just so you can see the what our keyframes are doing. So here we have our tree. Our rotations here could be controlled by transition patches, so could our train, for example, and even, to be honest, the colours of our baubles. However, if we wanted something to rotate around this tree, it would be quite annoying to have a transition patch, going into transition patch, going into transition patch, and so on and so on. What keyframes allow us to do is have a kind of more smooth control by dividing the three values. So in Spark AR, everything is divided by X, Y, and Z. Even color is technically split into these three values, although color-wise it's technically RGB. So X is red, Y is green, and Z is blue. But if I was to click on my little tree here, you notice I've got this little bauble thing that spins around the tree, and it's going around the tree, and this is actually all controlled via the one keyframe sequence. Oh, that's not the one there. So that bauble going around the tree, orbiting it, is being controlled by these three values here. So I'm just going to start off by creating a new project, and this will be very rudimentary. We won't be going into anything really advanced with this, mainly because to kind of play about with keyframes you do need to spend quite a bit of time, and this is just to kind of get you an understanding of the principles. And again, if you've done any video editing, this should hopefully start to click with you fairly quickly. So I'm just going to create a basic face mesh. I'm just going to add a material to it. So keyframes in Spark AR can control color, position, scale, rotation. It can control even the visibility of a property of a object. Basically anything that has a little arrow icon theoretically can be controlled via the keyframe option. The keyframes are not an addition that we add to our palette project. They're not something we have to enable in project settings. They're not something over in our properties of the actual object we've got selected. They are a patch. So what I'm now going to do is I'm just going to open up my patch editor. And what we're going to do is the most basic of keyframing to start off with, which is we're going to look at how to control color with keyframes. And then we'll look at rotation or position afterwards. So I'm just going to select my color, and I'm going to use the texture input property, and like so. And then I'm going to right click in my patch editor window, and I'm going to search for the keyframe tool. And again, some of this stuff you can do with transitions, some of the stuff you can do with keyframes. Both are valid cases. Just keyframes give you a little bit more control, but it's a little bit more tricky to get your head around. So if we open up our keyframe property here, you can see we've got this sort of red line here. If I click on the Y value, you've got Y and Z. So X, Y, Z, or red, green, blue if we're dealing with colors or materials. At the top here, we have this little blue line here. If we drag this along, this is our duration bar essentially, so how long the animation is going to play throughout. This 60F represents 60 frames. So within Spark AR, 60 frames is about 1 second, typically. And again, this depends on the kind of medium you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with, for example, film or media, standard television programs, it's typically between 24 and 30 frames a second, depending on your country and how it's displayed or interlaced. Video games typically aim for at least 60, but obviously higher is better typically. Animation can be as low as 12, or for example, like stop motion, for example. So we're dealing with 60 frames a second, so if we take that every 60 is 1 second, that gives us an idea of how long our animation is going to be playing, and that's how we start to time things. Down here in our duration, this is how long our sort of duration is, but we can also control this by dragging this blue bar up here. The frame button here goes to the frame that we tell it to, so if I say go to frame 10, I just type in 10 and it moves our little yellow line here, which is our scroll bar, to the 10 position or 10th frame. The zoom bar here just basically allows us to see more of our values and our properties. So our top bar is our duration, and the values on our y-axis or vertical sort of area here, these are our properties that would go into our inputs. So if I was looking at the face mesh here, we've got X, Y, Z, these would be the values here, would denote the values along this y-axis. These little diamonds, as I sort of hinted at within After Effects and other editing programs, these are our linear key points. So if I was, let's just hook this up just to show an example of this. Because we're working with color, and color is RGB, or red, green, blue, we need to drag from this to a pack patch to basically extract those three values. I'm going to change this to a vector 2, and I'm just going to make this 1, so 1 will allow everything to be full opacity essentially. So I'm going to drag this on to my material, and you'll now notice that our mask has gone completely black, and that's because our keyframe values here are starting at 0. If I was to drag my first keyframe up to, let's say, 1, keep the others at 0, you notice it's now red, so that means the red value is 1 or full. If we were to drag the blue up, it now becomes more of a pink colour. It's likewise, if I drag the green up, it will start to become lighter until I start to overtake it, and then it will start to become yellow. So there is some expectations of learning the RGB values within computer programs to be able to understand how to achieve certain colours. So let's say I want this to start at this colour here. I'm going to move my timeline along to, let's say, 1 second. And I could either drag the little keyframes here, or I could manually type them into these controls here. So to give Spark AR actually helps us with colour, for example, by giving the x-axis as red. So if I was to say, oh, I want it to go redder now, so I'm going to make it go to 2, so increase the red value. And I want the y to be actually a -1. So what I need to do is I have to type in the values here and press enter to confirm those keyframe points. If I was to type a value and then just move on to the next value without hitting enter, it would not generate our keyframe for us. Another way of doing it is if we used to move along a timeline, like let's say here, and then type in all the values of, let's say, 1, 1, 1, and then hit the add keyframe button here, you notice that it still doesn't really do anything, but it does generate us a new keyframe point. That's not what I want. It's a kind of a nuisance at the moment with Spark AR. It's something that I wish Spark AR would have a kind of record function, for example, where we could over here enter the values, where with the record button or auto keyer turned on, and then it would automatically keyframe for us. Sadly, at this point in time, it does not. So we do have to make sure we enter our values in manually and press enter on each of our 3 values to generate those desired key points or keyframes essentially. So if I now hit play, it will now transition through those colours. Let's just move this keyframe duration down a little bit. Now if I wanted this to play automatically, I could input a input controller. So this could either be an animation linked to a tap screen or gesture control. I'm just going to use the loop animation because again it's just for the purposes of demonstration. Hook this up to my animation progress, and now it will indefinitely play through that animation sequence. I can increase the duration to slow down the playback. If I hit mirrored, it will now play forwards and backwards. And basically, again, this is something that we could control via transitions, but if we wanted to have a lot more colors or a lot more values, then keyframes, having it all in one patch is just a lot more neater and tidier and just gives that a little bit more finesse control than we would have typically. So now we have our most basic color control. Let's have a look at something a little bit more, I don't want to say advanced, but a little bit more real world case scenario. Okay, so we've looked at how we can use the keyframe tool to control color. Now we're going to look at how we can use keyframes to control position, scale or rotation. So we've just added a basic little sphere to my scene, and I've just put a world texture on it. Again, it's nothing overly amazing, it's something just to illustrate a point. But if we look at the sphere properties here, we have the X, Y, Z values here. So again, any of these we can control. So let's say I want this to start to dart around my screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add the keyframe patch again. And I'm just going to also add a transition just to kind of show a distinction between the two processes. So with the keyframe tool, we can have a kind of almost infinite number of keyframes. So we can have it go from one value to a second value to a third to a fourth, so on and so on. Whereas when we're looking at the transition patch, we only have 2 values, a start value, so the starting X, Y, Z value, or starting 3 colors, RGB, and then the end values that will be transitions between the 2. So we can only control those 2 value points. We can also hook the transition into another transition and so on, as I said earlier, but then it becomes a kind of convoluted mess. You can also animate everything obviously in Blender or in Cinema 4D. But if you don't really feel comfortable with these programs, the keyframe tool is something to definitely get your head around. The transition patch does allow us to control things like the curvature, so whether it ramps sort of speed between those two values, sort of slow and fast and slow, or in and out bounce, etc., which we can't really do with keyframes. So we do have to sort of work around the limitations as it currently stands. So I'm just going to have this sphere bounce around my scene. So I'm going to use the position. And one thing to kind of bear in mind before we hook anything up to our keyframe, because everything by default with our new keyframe patch, it always sets to 000 on the three values, is if you already have something positioned where you want it to kind of be in your scene, it's a good idea to kind of make a note of the values before we hook it up to our keyframe patch here. So I'm going to open up my keyframe patch. We have our three values, our X, Y, and Z, all on top of each other like before. Now, one thing I wish that Spark AR Studio had, and doesn't at this point in time, is also keyframer. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could sort of change the values over here when it hooked up to it, and it automatically change our values in our patch sequence? Sadly, that's not the case. So we do need to kind of make a note of numbers. We do also need to remember to, every time we add a value or change a value down here, to press enter on our keyboard to confirm those changes. Otherwise, as you start to get further down the line, you may start to notice that it's not behaving the way you intend it to. So if every 60 frames is 1 second, I'm going to say at about this point here, let's say 1 second, I'm going to want it to move to this point here. So I'm just going to change my starting values to begin with. So it's going to be negative 0.02. Oh, negative 0.02. Press enter. There we go. And I'm going to do the same on my other value. So negative 0.1. And negative 0.2 on the Z. There we go. I'm just going to hook this up to my sphere, and I'm just going to now readjust those values so it sort of again is roughly back where it was. So I can see in real time, as long as my keyframe or my sort of yellow slider here is at 0, the initial value. So I can still make adjustments. That'll do. It's not perfect, but it'll do. So it starts here, and then at 1 second, I want this to move to this corner. So I actually want to keep the Z-axis. Sorry, I want to keep the Y-axis as is. So that's negative 0.13. So at 60 seconds, I'm going to type negative 0.13 and press enter to confirm. So our Y value shouldn't change. And I also need to do the same on my X axis. I need to select the X axis to bring up the values. So that's 0.17. Again, if I hover over the keyframes or click and hold over a keyframe, it tells me the value. So 0.17, enter. Oh, making sure I'm on the actual correct property, which I wasn't. There we go. And on my X-axis, I want to move this a little bit. So you'll notice that they've just unhooked there, so I just need to rehook them up. Sometimes that happens, it's a little bit annoying. So let's just, again, readjust these values. And then let's say at this point here, I want this to now move. So I'm going to add a new keyframe. Click on the X, Y, and Z to add a new keyframe for all three of those values. And then I want it to move forwards a little bit, which will also make it look bigger because it's moving closer to the camera. I want it to move up, and then I want it to move back to the middle. Move back to 180. Add a new keyframe for my 3 values. Bring this back down. Bring this back into the middle. And then move this to my other side. Like so. Another thing you can't do at the moment is you can't actually copy and paste keyframes, which again is a little bit annoying. So at the moment, the only way to kind of see your values is to sort of scribble along here. But as you see, the X value here actually is well, it is 0, but it's not the easiest thing to see as we're kind of working on it. So the keyframe tool is a good addition. It still needs a bit of work before it kind of gets to the kind of state that I would personally prefer. So you still got more control if you used to animate this in something like Blender or Cinema 4D. But if you don't want to go through a 3D modeling program and import an animation asset, you can do it now in Spark AR Studio. I'm now going to just create another keyframe patch, and I'm going to just control the rotation of my sphere. And this one's going to be super easy because it's just going to rotate on the one axis. So I'm going to rotate it on the y-axis of 360 degrees. Another thing, I kind of wish I could just lock these so I wouldn't drag them as I'm kind of moving around. There we go. So now I'm just going to hook this up to my 3D rotation and then hook that up to my animation. And now my sphere is spinning. If I wanted this to invert the values, I could add a negate. And what this will do is it will actually inverse the values. So if you wanted to use one animation controller or keyframe controller for 2 different objects, and you wanted one to be rotating on a positive and one to be rotating on a negative, we could have one just hooked up directly and then the other one into a negate. And what the negate will do is it just takes those 3 values and then inverts them essentially. And that's the kind of fundamentals of the keyframe patch. Like I said, it's kind of early days. There's a few things I wish it had. I wish it had auto keyframe. I wish it was a bit easier to sort of control the keyframes. It wasn't quite as tetchy. If you want to smooth things out, you just have to add new values, and you do need to remember to press enter every time you change a value down here. But any property that has this little arrow input, you can control using the keyframe tool with a little bit of finesse. So I would definitely encourage you to just play about with it, practice what you can do with the keyframe, what you can't do with a keyframe. If you need anything that needs to have the 3 values packed into one value, use a pack tool to pack it into a vector 2. You can also unpack those 3 values. So let's just use an unpack tool here. So by unpacking, you can see the X, Y, Z values here. So you can take the X value, the Y value, and the Z value, and you can use those 3 different values to control different things as well. So that is the keyframe patch within version 104 of Spark AR Studio. I expect to see a lot of amazing things done with it, a lot better than what I did. I really did not spend any kind of real time on this. And like I said, you can get away with using transition patches for quite a lot of stuff. The joy and the advantage of the keyframe tool largely comes into just not having to have keyframes going into keyframes, really. So you don't have to have a transition patch going into a transition patch, and so on and so forth. And for color control, it does make things a lot easier, but again, you would need to learn the values of RGB, remembering that 1 is basically full of that colour, 0 being none of that colour, and everything in between being a kind of spectrum along that point. So I've been Stephen Fisher. We will be back with some more Spark AR tutorials soon. I wish you all a Merry Christmas if you're watching this before Christmas, and I will see you again very soon. Goodbye.